Are we? Let's see. Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. All right, sort of handle that. Today we're going to be talking about our sort of new crazy protest world. It seems as if over the past, really the past year or so, the whole world seems to be sort of like protesting. There's a lot going on. We'll talk about some of the countries individually, but more importantly, talk about sort of some broader theories of why this might be happening. For those of you who are new to this, um, you may notice that there is a live chat thing next to your viewing window. You are encouraged to chime in the live chat, have a discussion with the other folks who show up. You are encouraged to be as brutal as you want to be to me, my haircut, my views, my appearance. Go for it. Do whatever you want. But with other people in the chat, we ask that you be civil. We accept a broad range of views here, but we prefer that everyone be civil to each other. And if I notice in the corner of my eye that somebody's being disruptive in the live chat, then I will block you. All right, so today we are talking about protests. They're everywhere. It's this been for the past year. It's been this sort of steady background noise. It's been kind of constant for me. Like I've been in this position where something will crop up in Algeria or Sudan, and I'm like, oh, I should really put together some videos on that. I should really mention that this is huge. You know, these protests are happening. And then something else will crop up a week later, and I'll be like, oh no, maybe I should focus on that, focus on this. And I've sort of got, you know, the main issues that I cover on here, sort of Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, whatever else comes up. U.S. politics sometimes intervenes, and I think I've been missing the broader story. But I don't think I'm really alone on that. There are many news organizations who are covering these topics, but as far as these topics, these protests everywhere, actually like making it into general consciousness, like it's just not something that happens. And what's happening really is extraordinary. We're talking about massive worldwide protests. Every country's story is different. There's a different set of circumstances, a different set of events, a different group of things that makes these things happen. But it's the consistency that's quite crazy. You know, in the past, we've seen, or rather, in sort of my conscious lifetime, you know, our time of paying attention to this, we've seen, like in the Arab Spring, for example, an entire region go off. But this is worldwide. I mean, if we're seeing people in the streets in Hong Kong, in Chile, in Lebanon, in Sudan, everywhere, it's quite extraordinary. I'm going to talk briefly about some of these countries, but I mean, I'm going to do a poor job because this can only be a survey. I mean, each of these countries deserves its own produced video diving into what the issues are in that particular place. But I just wanted to run through like some of these details just to give a sense for those of you who might not be aware of just how massive this is. What's crazy about this is, so last week I decided I would do a live chat on these protests, these sort of accelerating worldwide protests. And what's interesting is since I uploaded that, since I decided to put this, you know, live chat together, three more countries, three more countries have gone crazy, and I mean, that was 4 days ago that I decided to set up this live chat. Um, so, I mean, there's a variety. There's Bolivia is in the news this morning after some suspect that there may have been some chicanery around the re-election of Evo. Is it Evo or Evo? Evo Morales, the socialist-leaning president of Bolivia. We had re-elections yesterday, elections that are kind of fraught because I think he wasn't supposed to I think there was both term limits and a referendum that he lost on whether he should run again, but he ran again. So that's, this morning we woke up to news that Bolivia had blown up, and there were also issues around forest fires in Bolivia, maybe 2 weeks back, but Bolivia is the news this morning. Chile has been the big thing to focus on over the past week. Chile was surprising. The sort of standard story about Chile is that, this is the rich Latin American country where everything's okay, and they've sort of settled all their issues. Well, that's not the case, because not only has Santiago been completely immobilized, people are dying. I think 11 people have died in Chile so far. I mean, that's huge. I mean, that's not, it doesn't fit the narrative, to say the least. Now that was launched as sort of in response to the rise in the fare price of subways, but it's something that we'll see over and over again. And I saw myself years ago in Turkey, is that it'll be something small and minor that will launch this protest, but the protests are obviously about much more than that. So it's the fact that they raised the prices on subways, and I assume Santiago, that launched the Chile uprising, but there's been a range of issues around income inequality, corruption that have bothered people in Chile for quite some time, and this has become the launching, the sort of straw that breaks the camel's back. So that's Chile. Lebanon. This is another small thing. The Lebanese government, this is insane, attempted to introduce a tax on individual WhatsApp messages, which is, I mean, it's cartoonishly dumb. It's the sort of thing that is guaranteed to piss people off. It's also, like, quite clearly, to my mind anyway, is an attempt to shut down political communication, because my understanding is sort of mass WhatsApp chats are becoming very important for political mobilization now that Facebook has been kind of co-opted by ruling classes, even though WhatsApp is owned by Facebook. But anyway, so that was a small thing that launched this anger in Lebanon, but it's also a reaction to years of corruption, a bad economy. Another aspect in Lebanon, which is something that is a through line across many of these countries, is that I'm not 100% sure if Lebanon, it was the IMF specifically, but this attempt that in Lebanon that they were making to sort of introduce new taxes to balance the budget is something that was required by outside funders, outside forces who are sort of can hold local governments hostage and make them do things in order to get loans, in order to get continued funding. I'm not sure if that was the IMF specifically, but that is quite possibly an aspect of that. So that's just the 3 countries that have gone nuts in the past week. I don't know if using the term "gone nuts" is the right way to talk about it, but they have risen up. There are serious protest movements, surprising protest movements, sections of large cities being shut down, fires in some cases, Chile specifically, deaths. That's 3 countries in the past week. I mean, that enough should be worth focusing on. But of course, we're all wrapped up in Trump's activities in Syria, myself as well, as you can tell from last week's production. If we stretch out to the past month, we've got actions in Ecuador and Peru. These are obviously different situations, but you've got this idea of, like, much of Latin America sort of rising up in anger. Ecuador, Ecuador was quite extreme. The minor launching thing in this case was a withdrawn fuel subsidy. This is an issue we see over and over again. And often in petrostates, sometimes not in petrostates. I think this is an issue in Indonesia, which is, of course, a petrostate, but not as much. But Ecuador is very much a country with large petroleum supplies, so the government subsidizes the supply of gas, home heating oil, etc., for the public. So in Ecuador, they knocked down those subsidies. The guy in charge attempted to eliminate those subsidies. and the country went nuts. He actually had to withdraw. The Ecuadorian president, I believe it is, had to actually withdraw his government from the center of the capital city. He had to move the government because it was so extreme. This was specifically as a result of IMF requirements. The IMF does not like fuel subsidies. I don't like fuel subsidies. I think they're distorting and fairly clearly a bad idea. But it led to massive destruction in Ecuador and a very powerful protest movement that attained its goals. What's also interesting here is another theme across all these countries is that these protest movements tend to reach their goals quite quickly. The subway fare hike in Chile has been done away with. The fares are now down again. The absurd WhatsApp tax in Lebanon, that's gone as well. In Ecuador, my understanding is that the protests in Ecuador have stopped. This was something that was happening about 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, because the government agreed to reinstall the fuel subsidies. So in Peru, it's a different situation that I really don't know enough about because there's hundreds of countries. Which my understanding is that in Peru, the president dissolved Congress because Congress wasn't helping his anti-corruption crusade enough. Anti-corruption crusades are something that I think we should all probably be suspicious of. We should all support them, of course. Corruption is bad, but from Xi Jinping to Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, we've seen that anti-corruption crusades can be used to consolidate power in sort of authoritarian regimes. However, I don't think that's necessarily fair. There's certainly many opponents of the Peruvian president who would say that's what's going on, that he's just trying to consolidate power. But I've only read a couple articles on this, and both of them seem to say that, well, there's arguments on either side. Maybe the Congress is right and the president is acting in a dictatorial way. Maybe the president is right and the Congress is hopelessly corrupt and this was the right thing to do. I haven't been able to read enough to sort of make any decisions about that. I don't know Peru well enough. But that too was another situation where we have massive protests that have had a huge impact on the country. Iraq, we've got hundreds dead. Not hundreds, sorry, but in Iraq we have over 100 peaceful protesters shot over the past month by Iraqi security services. I'm not entirely sure what the launching event for the Iraq uprising was, but I do know that corruption is a tremendous issue there. It's been a country essentially destroyed by the U.S. intervention back in 2003, sort of desperately trying to put itself back together. And then, of course, the ISIS sort of Islamic State that was launched in the space that the United States opened up in Syria also made things more difficult. So Iraq has had a terrible time. And my understanding, I don't think anybody really disputes this, is that they have a tremendously corrupt ruling class installed by the United States, and it's sort of a nightmare. There was some happy news out of Iraq recently that the government is actually going to be prosecuting, has fired and is going to be prosecuting some of the generals and police forces that were responsible for killing over 100 people in Iraq. So, that's a plus. Okay, so that's just, and also Egypt. In Egypt, there are really just a few nights of protest, but we have to acknowledge that because they're probably the most extraordinarily brave of any of the protesters we're talking about here. Egypt is run by a man named Sisi, who is supported by the United States, who sort of launched his dictatorship with the slaughter of 800 peaceful protesters in one afternoon. So honestly, a lot of the folks who engaged in that Egypt uprising are in jail, and many of them are, honestly, it would not be surprising if dozens of them are dead. Iraq is in a rough space, but at least there's some accountability left. Egypt is just a terrifying place, and those are some extraordinarily brave protesters that um, have quite possibly already paid the ultimate price for standing up against the Egyptian dictator. I mean, that stuff. So that's just the last month. Everything I've talked about, those are things that have just happened in October. That's extraordinary. And and I'm not even mentioning all the countries that have had issues, things going on in October. If you expand say you expand out to the full year, I mean, there's some things that I have talked about on this channel. There's Algeria and Sudan, more towards the beginning of this year. Two countries that are very reliant on oil, and when the money stopped coming in from oil stuff, um, as has been the case for 5 years now, the sort of regimes in those countries stopped being able to paper over all the cracks. Sudan has experienced real changes. I'm doing the research for a series on that should come out in the next 3 or 4 months. Algeria, I have done a video talking about the changes there. Hong Kong obviously is a huge, huge issue. That's Hong Kong is an outlier. It's probably the one protest movement that has received adequate coverage. But what's interesting about it is that it's covered without all of this context. It's covered without all of this acknowledgement that all these things are happening everywhere else in the world at the same time. And while, of course, Hong Kong has its own unique characteristics, just as Chile has its own unique characteristics, Peru, Iraq, Lebanon have their own unique characteristics. It's not outside of this larger story, because I do believe there is a larger story here. And Hong Kong, well, of course, it's got its own details and idiosyncrasies. I believe it is part of this same story. And now, if you go all the way back to, say, a year ago, back to last fall and winter, you have France. France had the whole Gilets jaunes, the yellow vest movement that kept Paris and I believe other cities immobilized for a series of weekends. So what we're dealing with here is a kind of a worldwide uprising. I don't think there's enough coverage of how crazy this is. So to be clear, I've talked about maybe 8 to 10 countries here. There are dozens more. There are, I haven't mentioned what's going on in Spain. I haven't mentioned what's going on in Indonesia. I haven't mentioned what's going on in Haiti. I mean, it's happening everywhere. So what we've got is a worldwide protest sort of bonanza. I don't know. I'm not. I should have probably formulated better terminology than saying shit's going crazy. But it is, and it's troubling in some ways. It's inspiring in a lot of ways, and it's fascinating. The one thing that I can say for certain. So from this point on, I'm gonna just talk about theories and weird, ideas of why all of this might be happening. But it's all speculation. I don't know. The one thing that I do know for certain is that we absolutely should be talking more about this. I mean, the world is burning down in important ways. That seems too negative. The world is changing in very serious ways, and we're not paying attention because we're too focused on the Trump show, and that's not good. It's so sort of talking about sort of parallels to what we're going through now. There are great protest years in sort of European history and in world history. I don't think it's quite accurate to talk about 2019 being in that category yet. Wow. Okay. I just noticed a big super chat with a specific question. I will come back to answer that question, Ruben Garcia. I hadn't mentioned that if you have a question that you ask while I'm doing the presentation, Um, uh, just remember to ask that question again once the Q&A starts. Thank you, Ruben Garcia, for that super chat. I will get to that Suharto question. Please ask your questions again once the Q&A period starts, because I don't have the mental bandwidth to sort of look at the live chat as I'm talking. So we're talking about the significance of 2019 as a protest year. In European and world history, there are other well-known years that are tremendously significant. In the ones that come to mind, the most significant are 1968 and 1848. Now, 1848 is, it is just European history, but what happened in 1848 was because of new communication technologies. That should ring some alarm bells for you folks, but because of new communication technologies, the telegraph, the railroad, a revolution, I can't remember if it started in sort of southern Sicily or if it started in France, but regardless, historians might even argue over that. But regardless, revolutions that started in one corner of Europe could use these new technologies to spread all over the entire continent. So that's 1848, which is a huge protest year. 1968 is another huge protest year in the United States, because we only like to focus on our own navel. We like sort of staring at our own bellies. We only think of the anti-war protests and sort of dovetailing with the tail end of civil rights protests that made 1968 and 1969 such huge protest years in the United States, but it was everywhere, from Czechoslovakia to many countries in Africa, to Mexico, to France. That was actually a worldwide protest movement that was launched in France. I believe I guess it's considered to lead to the final end of Charles de Gaulle's government in France, but it was tremendously significant. I mean, in Europe, they'll still talk about the 68ers. I mean, it's this sort of baby boomer self-conception of sort of protesting, and it sort of formed a whole culture. So 1968, 1848, these are iconic protest years. And I think it's too early to say that 2019 has been a similar year, but that might not be so far off. It's kind of crazy that with all of this stuff that's happening, we're just not really even paying attention. It's all about the Trump show, and I think that's a real shame, because I mean, it's for someone who like myself grew up in the United States, sort of idolizing some of these events from the 1960s and protest movements and whatnot. It would be a shame if something of that significance was happening and we didn't even notice. It's kind of interesting. I guess that gets to another question. It's just personally, it's kind of interesting for me as someone who's no longer a young person looking at this. I was lucky enough in my early 30s, I guess my mid 30s, to go from hearing about protest movements and uprisings and whatnot for my whole life, to being in Turkey at the right time to actually participate in 2013, the sort of Gezi Park uprising. I lived quite close to Gezi Park and spent that summer getting tear gassed, and it was tremendously exciting for me. But I was talking with some other friends of mine who participated in that protest, and they were all, I think, they were all in their 20s at the time, and now they're all in their 30s. And it was interesting. Sort of, they were sort of talking about how they wouldn't want to be a part of that at this current point in their life. And it's kind of interesting that as you get older, you get a lot more risk averse. And I wonder if my attitude towards these protests, my description of them as, ooh, crazy, or the world's burning down, I wonder if that comes from the fact that I'm old and I don't consider running from cops as exciting as I did in my early 30s. I don't consider tear gas as exciting as I did in my early 30s. And I consider the disruption, even back in my early 30s, I was still a corporate lawyer, and I was very conscious as the Gezi uprising was happening of the economic destruction that protests can yield. You know, I think I had purchased a Turkish stock market ETF. I'd made a small investment that had done very well in my time in Turkey. It had doubled. And then after Gezi, it plummeted and has not yet come back to the price that it was when I purchased it back in 2009. So, yeah, I was always conscious of that. But I wonder as I get older, am I more leery of protests? That's something I should be conscious of because um, I don't think that this massive uprising is a bad thing. I think that it's moved. It has brought great progress in Algeria and Sudan, the countries that I've looked at the most closely in relation to these protest movements. Um, so I don't. Uh, I'm not against these, but you do have to recognize that there's a cost to this as well. The fact that many of these Latin American countries were sort of attempting to get their finances in line, and now they can't because of these protest movements. Does have costs. Though on the other hand, it's these protests may yield better systems in those countries that will eventually allow the finances to be put back in order as well. So there's pluses and minuses of this, pluses and minuses in this. Um, but I think on balance, it's good for people to for people to make their rulers pay attention and make their rulers serve the people. That's what should happen, and protests are a way of doing that. So I support them. So the question is sort of why is this happening? I think there's a number of proposed solutions that we've seen swimming around. Some that we haven't seen much of, but I think we'll probably see more of as people start paying attention to this. But I think that all of these explanations do have some measure of truth to them. I think they all make sense to a degree. But I think there's an underlying story here that all of them sort of sprout out of that I think is worth paying attention to, and I'll get to that by the end. So just today, Tyler Cohen and Bloomberg. It was honestly, I think, one of the highest profile attempts to acknowledge and understand what's going on here that I've seen so far. Was talking about how, I skimmed the article, but I think he was talking about how it's the internet and it's new technologies that are basically allowing the people to. Tyler Cohen's a very libertarian, pro markets kind of guy, saying that it's the internet and new technologies that are allowing the peoples of these countries to act more as outraged consumers now. So they're allowed. They've figured out a way to sort of veto things that they don't like. I think there's some truth to that. I think it's true that a lot of these protests were launched out of small, sort of consumer ideas like I don't want to tax on my WhatsApp. I don't want my train fare to be more expensive. Sort of basics like that. But I think that Cohen, to the extent that Cohen is saying that it's really just about this penny ante bullshit, I think he's missing the mark. I think it's these small issues create a lever to get at much bigger issues, much more overarching issues. But he's absolutely right to focus on just the way that these tools are changing. With the Arab Spring, in 2011, with the Turkish uprising in 2013 that I was a part of, Facebook was a tremendous part of that. I mean, it helped sort of mobilize things. Facebook now has been sort of it's working more and more closely with governments to control what gets put on and put forward on that platform. But Facebook also owns WhatsApp, which is used in interesting ways, and an array of other services that I neither understand nor know much about because I am becoming an old person. But yes, the internet, the connections. This is the same dynamic that we saw in 1848, which was in the European revolutions of 1848, which sort of new technologies, railroads, telegraphs, allowed revolution and ideas behind uprisings to spread all over the world. We are absolutely seeing the same thing with today's technologies, be it Facebook, WhatsApp, just cell phones more generally, texts, what have you. And so internet is absolutely a factor in this, but that's not why these things are happening. So I think there's left and right interpretations of this that I think one of which I've definitely seen, the sort of more left interpretation of this, and the well, I guess they're both actually sort of could be construed as left. No, they're not really, because sort of the left, this is sort of a left anti-establishment view would be to blame neoliberalism, whereas a sort of sane person establishment view would be to blame Donald Trump. So those are, superficially they're both left, but they're really not. They're sort of, to complain about neoliberalism is more left-leaning. To complain about Trump instability is what a sane person would do. So the neoliberalism interpretation, I think, actually makes actually both. I think both of these, is it neoliberalism? Is it Trump? I think both of those make sense. I think many would say that Trump is neoliberalism or whatever, but anyway, that's a whole other conversation we don't need to get into. The neoliberalism idea would be that, especially applying to Latin America, Chile specifically, because Chile is seen as a sort of standard bearer or poster child for the Washington Consensus and the idea that by using sort of right-leaning, economic approaches, Chile became very prosperous, and now Chile has exploded and people are dying in the streets. So neoliberalism, the critique here is saying that, well, actually, these protests are happening because international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, lenders from the West, from the United States and Europe, are forcing these countries to do austerity that people hate, and that's why we're seeing all these protests, is sort of in a reaction to austerity. And I think there's some superficial validity to that. I think that gets at a real truth here. Of course, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to see how that interpretation plays into what's happening in Venezuela, an extraordinarily unhappy country that's seen obviously years worth of protests against a very sort of left-wing anti-austerity government, or Bolivia, which is actually a country that's been tremendously successful, happy country under a socialist government. So it's a little harder to put, if the world is rebelling against neoliberalism, then why are Bolivia and Venezuela in just as poor shape as Ecuador or Peru, where you have that a more compelling case that the presidents, the people are rebelling against, are neoliberal technocrats. So I think that does get to something very interesting, this sort of neoliberalism idea, but it's not the whole story. I think it's definitely got some truth to it, but it's not the whole story. The Trump instability question is, I think, for folks who believe that there was a liberal international order that the United States sits at the center of and helps to maintain. I believe that to a degree. I think it's not really an international order. It was an American order. It still is an American order. We all live in the U.S. world system. And the argument there is that, okay, having this lunatic Donald Trump at the middle, who you can't pay attention. This is why nobody's noticed that we're doing a 1968 or an 1848 right in 2019, is because nobody can pay attention to the fact that the world is in flames when we've got the most powerful man in the world just putting out constant provocations on his Twitter feed. We've essentially got a reality TV show or shock jock president. And yes, obviously, that's terrible for the U.S. world system. That's terrible for stability worldwide. So I think as sort of a second order effect, yes, like you can blame Trump to this for Trump for this to some extent. If Trump weren't there making such a mess of things, then maybe the IMF or the World Bank or other international institutions, international banks would have the time to sort of sit back and be like, oh, wait a second. Gee, turns out all this austerity stuff we're still trying to push down people's throat isn't working out. And it's actually leading to disaster. So maybe we should cut that shit out. They can't, they don't have the time to breathe to focus on that because they're too focused on crazy stuff that Trump is doing. I do think actually that Trump instability plays in to what the real reason, the main reason that's going on here, the main reason these protests are happening. But yeah, I'll get to that. Well, I guess I'll get to that right now. Are you ready? You ready? It's not really too revolutionary. What we're dealing with here is the end of economic growth, or the end sounds very final. But what we're dealing with here is a dip in the economic cycle, a dip in the worldwide economy. That is what is at the root of all of this. And it's hard to see, especially from the U.S. perspective, where we're putting up, we're still putting up 2.5% growth, mostly what we've had for the past, at least since the crisis. So in the U.S. it's masked, but the rest of the world has been dealing with economic slowdown, and they've been dealing with it for years now. I looked at some figures. World GDP growth. Obviously, gross domestic product is difficult to measure. It doesn't necessarily represent everything that matters, yada, yada. However, the World Bank does put together world GDP figures. And since 2012, world GDP growth has been under 3%. And I think that's the longest stretch that world GDP growth has been under 3% since the 60s or even before. Basically, essentially since the World Bank existed or started collecting this data, world growth, GDP growth, is at the lowest it has been for the longest it has been. Now, this is kind of interesting that since 2012 number doesn't really reflect exactly what happened, because in the initial years after the financial crisis in 2008, 2009, a lot of the world did really well because the developed world did poorly. And when the developed world does poorly, the central banks make money more available in an effort to make things get going again. So that money being more available for loans, for businesses, for investment, whatever, it was actually good for the rest of the world. So the rest of the world actually got a bump that is masked in the worldwide figures by the fact that the developed world, Europe, Japan, the United States, have been doing pretty crappily since 2008. The rest of the world didn't start doing really crappily until 2012, 2013, when sort of the quantitative easing, easy money era from the US central bank sort of came to a close. So what I'm saying here is that the through line behind all of these countries, all of these protest movements, yes, every single one is unique. It's its own set of problems. But if you look at all of them, one aspect for all of these protest movements is economic slowdown and economic failure. What an interesting thing to do is to take any of those countries, any of the countries we've discussed in this presentation, and just type into your browser Chile GDP per capita or Ecuador GDP per capita. And you'll notice on all of these countries, there's a huge, it's this huge hockey stick growth up until about 2012, well, obviously there's a big dip for everybody in 2008, but then the growth continues until 2012, 2013, and things level off. It doesn't plummet, things just level off. It's just stagnation. It's people all over the world who were used to rampaging economic growth for a very long time, just getting stagnation or economic falls. That's the story of what's happened over the past year. That's why we're getting this 2019. That was also the case in 1848 in Europe. It was the Hungry 40s. In I believe leading up to 1968 as well, there was some stuttering in the economy that sort of led to that. So what has happened is in this world that's more connected than it has ever been economically, and that was just firing on all cylinders for most of 2 decades, just sort of spewing growth everywhere. That has sort of stopped. We reached stagnation, not a crash yet, not a plummeting disaster everywhere, just a end of growth. And when people who have watched things get better all the time get stagnation, they get angry. And that's the consistent through line across all of these countries. And what a lot of this is about is China. Quite simply, it's the end of Chinese supergrowth. With so many of these countries, most of the Latin American countries I discussed, certainly every country in, certainly Iraq, every country, include every country in the Middle East, including Egypt and Lebanon, even though those countries don't have petroleum resources, they come in under this as well. All those Latin American countries, all these Middle Eastern countries are suffering because of the low oil price, as well as what the US central bank has done since 2014. So the central bank issues, the taper tantrum started in 2013. World oil prices plummeted in 2014. So Lebanon doesn't have oil resources, but Lebanon, especially the ruling parties in Lebanon, have been dependent on handouts from petrostates like Iran and Saudi Arabia for like ever. So Lebanon and Egypt is another country that doesn't have massive oil resources, but is dependent on handouts from Sunni oil states, are suffering as well. So commodities are a huge factor in this. Chile, while it does have a modern, service-based economy, is also tremendously dependent on resources, copper mines, etc. So there was this huge commodity. Another part of this story of rampaging economic growth since sort of 2000 or so was the commodity boom that was driven by China, because China was driving, was growing at like 10%. China was growing at like, sorry, I got drawn into the live chat there. China had been growing at 10%, 12% for decades. And as it was building out its economy, it was using natural resources very intensively. That has essentially stopped. China is still growing, don't get me wrong. China is still supposedly growing at around 5 to 6% a year. There's a lot of questions about those statistics, that they might be being gamed, that they might not be that high. But even if they are accurate, 5 to 6% growth is not 10% growth. And now the growth that China is going through, because it has to be, is more focused on its own economy, more focused on building a consumer sector, more focused on services. It's not this same intensive sort of European 19th century focus on raw materials and more copper and more steel and more concrete. It's more jobs for app developers, or more, more lawyers and architects and content creators. So China, even with the economic growth it's got left, isn't growing its demand for resources. So the rest of the world is not benefiting as much. Now, Trump absolutely bears some responsibility. US President Trump absolutely bears some responsibility for this, but he's not the main reason. I mean, China essentially just reached a point where you can only build so many more cities, you can only build so many more high-speed lines. They're going through a difficult transition themselves, where they have to be more innovative, more creative, and they're doing that. They're succeeding in doing that, but you're just not going to get the kinds of growth figures that they got, going from an agrarian economy to an industrial and then a post-industrial one. The China growth story is over. Trump, with his trade war, has absolutely made this worse. Things didn't need to be as bad as they were. There's some aspects of what Trump has done that have that have helped the U.S. economy, specifically doing the kind of stimulus spending that the Republicans would never allow Obama to do, and that has helped the U.S. economy. But this trade war stuff and what it's done to sort of trade relations, not just between the United States and China and the United States and everybody else, but between everybody else, is absolutely exacerbating the effects of the end of the Chinese growth engine. Now, so this protest wave, this could very much be a good thing. In periods of rampaging economic growth, everybody gets a little slice. The rich tend to get fabulously richer, but the people at the bottom sort of get enough. You know, they got smartphones, they got enough to sort of keep them happy because they were on an upward trajectory. I've found, just sort of in the amount of reading I've been doing about sort of Britain in the 1800s, you know, the British Empire, I've found that there's this dynamic where you can actually make a lot of great political progress towards social justice, for lack of a better word, during periods of economic stagnation or even economic decline. The British had this extraordinary, you know, they were on top throughout the 1800s. They were the most powerful country in the world. But it wasn't like it was all economic growth to the ceiling. It wasn't. It was, you know, I think pretty much like maybe the 1850s were this incredible, like true, like rocket time, sort of comparable to the Chinese period of hypergrowth around the world. And then sort of the end of the 1890s up until World War I was another period of sort of rocket growth. But that's only like 20 years out of a century there. And you know, there were other times that were okay and whatnot, but there were also many times that were bad. And it was actually in those times that were bad that movements towards parliamentary reform, towards better labor laws, towards a whole range of things that make up what we consider to be the basis of a decent society today. Those are things that developed in the downturns. And because the masses sort of were no longer getting the easy, free gifts of rampaging economic growth, so they could step back and be like, hey, what the fuck? All you rich people, you know, bought all these private islands, but now that the economic growth isn't rampaging anymore, we're not getting anything anymore. So I think it's entirely possible that, you know, in Chile, in Iraq, in Indonesia, in Lebanon, that this sort of stagnation, this world economic stagnation, could have a positive effect. I mean, remember, like in the United States, the entirety of our social safety net, what little there is, was built during the Great Depression. That's not true. There was also, I mean, Johnson was also very, very important. But many important elements, Social Security, a lot of our banking regulation, you know, like came out of the Great Depression. And that was obviously a period of not just economic stagnation, but incredible economic destruction. So I think that one thing that is troubling, that, you know, a lot of these movements seem to just sort of be like screams of rage. You know, there don't seem to be leaders. There don't seem to be folks proposing a better program. I mean, and what that means is that, well, the sort of crappy, corrupt leaders that you have right now are going to continue to be the same crappy, corrupt leaders, but maybe they'll be able to come up with changes to the systems in these countries that will be improvements. And that'll be great. That'll be improvements. But the fact that none of these protest movements seem to have any leaders, you know, you need a horse to beat a horse. You know, you need to if you really want to replace the powerful people, you need people to replace them with. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But I do believe that these protests could lead to positive change. And I think that periods of economic stagnation have historically produced, because people get angry, have produced better systems. And then when economic growth returns, then each individual country is better situated to take advantage of that, and all the people in the country are better situated to take advantage of that economic growth. So I'm actually, in closing, I'm actually quite optimistic. I think to some degree it'd be nice if we had it'd be nice if we still had rampaging growth, economic growth. It's nice that everybody gets rich. It's been very nice. To some degree, all of these protest movements rely on expectations for something better that have been built by rampaging economic growth worldwide over the past 10, 15 years. So it'd be nice to get back there. How would we conceivably do it? India. India is, unfortunately, what's the old joke about Brazil? It's that Brazil is the country of the future, and it always will be. I think India sometimes seems to be in danger of doing that. We keep waiting for India's massive growth to start, and it keeps not happening. But I don't know. There are many African countries that might be experiencing sort of this kind of hyper growth over the next decade. So it'd be nice to have that back, but I think it's probably safe to assume that at least in my lifetime, we might not see the truly powerful economic growth engine of change that China provided. Like the last thing that's comparable to what China has provided to the world over the past 20 years in economic growth is the United States in the 19th century. So it may, in fact, have been a once in a century movement. But there are many, many ways for the world to improve, become better run and happier place, even outside of the context of once in a century economic growth spurts. Okay, that is 50 minutes. I think I have obviously not done full justice to any of these protest movements, but I have talked about them, which is more than I think many outlets can say. And I've proposed some theories. I hope those make sense. So has anybody got any questions? I noticed that there were some super chat questions. Where were they? Okay, Ruben Garcia points out that that's a super chat from Ruben Garcia. Thank you, sir. Catalonia is wanting to secede from Spain too. I think that's very true. I did not cover what's going on in Spain. I do actually have a video from about a year back talking about how the conflict between Spain and Catalonia is kind of, I think, might be Europe's future. That's sort of what the post-EU future for Europe looks like. And it's interesting, in that video from a year ago, I said, oh, it's great. At least there hasn't been any violence. They're not violent. But I think my understanding is that in recent protests in Spain, things have been getting a little more violent, which, is sort of inevitable when you have such different visions of what the country is going to look like, which I find, the violence sad. I haven't looked into the issue between Catalonia and Spain in any detail in over 2 years, so I can't really, or about a year, and I don't think I can really speak to that, but absolutely worth referencing. There was another super chat. Ruben Garcia again. Well, thank you, Ruben Garcia. The other question was, what do you think about Suharto's kids still having huge power over Indonesia, in particular Tommy Suharto? That's a really interesting question. I don't have a ton of detail there, but just for those who may not know, Suharto was the second sort of dictator of Indonesia after independence from the Netherlands. And he fell dramatically in the Asian financial crisis in 1997. I don't think he or anyone in his family was ever arrested, but they lost power, and there was a flourishing democracy was installed. and that democracy has continued to develop under current president who's just reelected, the Indonesian president Joko Widodo. I apologize for the pronunciation there. But what's an interesting facet is that after the dictatorship, after the Suharto dictatorship, despite the fact that he was, I think the massacre of 1 million communists in Indonesia happened under Sukarno, not Suharto, but I think Suharto was a general that was very prominent in carrying out that genocide. Not genocide, well, just mass murder. But there's never really been any consequences for the Suharto family, and the Suharto family still controls a lot in the economy, and I think they have strong relations to the military. So while Joko Widodo is a probably the most, I think, seen as the most sort of, I don't want to use the word populist because it's so tainted, but the most sort of democratic of the leaders that Indonesia has faced, he still has to deal with these power centers of the old regime that's been out of power for 22 years now. So I mean, his attempts to deal with, I think actually one of the reasons he's had such difficulty, not enough difficulty to get him to keep him from being reelected, was the fact that he wanted to talk about some of the atrocities committed by the old dictatorship. So I think that I think obviously people should want the old dictators and their families to lose power. However, I think that what Indonesia has done is probably intelligent, in that if in 1997 they had said, okay, Suharto, you're out and you're going to jail, all your family's going to jail, Indonesia wouldn't be a place that, if they'd done that, then Indonesia wouldn't be a place that, you know, built the world's tallest buildings in Kuala Lumpur for, you know, for about 8 months there before somebody else built taller ones. It'd be a country that had been mired in horrific civil war for the past 20 decades. It'd look like, that's one of the things that make me most angry about Syria, is that we actually know how to deal with people like Assad. Like Suharto is actually much worse than Assad. What you do is you bribe them. You make the place richer, and then eventually people demand democracy. And the most frustrating thing is that and people demand democracy, and the old regime gets to profit from this as well, and just sort of gets to step back, continue to be rich. Nobody dies. Democracies flourish. I think elites are, you know, sort of corrupt, violent elites are a part of every system. If that doesn't make sense, and I think that Indonesia has become a much wealthier, much more democratic, much happier country than it would have been if people had attempted to uproot the Suharto's root and branch. So does that mean that today I think it's a good thing that the Suhartos, Tommy Suharto, still have as much power as they do? Of course not. I think that all Indonesians should work to pay less attention to Tommy Suharto, to do what they can to deal with the embarrassment of the old dictator's kids still being powerful. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad thing that some of their power was preserved 22 years ago. So yeah. Okay, I think those are the super chats. Questions. MFF Victory asks, will Lebanon revolution succeed? I'm a little, depends on what you mean by succeed. It's already succeeded in getting those ridiculous WhatsApp taxes removed. That's success. I think that probably, how do you pronounce his name? Is it Saad Hariri or something? Probably it's time for the somewhat ridiculous. Oh man, is Hariri the president president. I have not looked into Lebanon as much detail as I want. Lebanon has a tremendously difficult system to deal with. It's in a really bad neighborhood. I think Lebanon will continue to have problems. It would be amazing if the current if the current Lebanese uh, uprising managed to deal with some corruption, but I think it's just going to be one part in a one stage in a long battle. I mean, back on Twitter, I was like, wait a second, didn't we do a cedar revolution? Because I remember in my back in my 20s, Lebanon had another popular uprising that actually, my understanding was that one Syria was tremendously powerful in Lebanon up until the Cedar Revolution in 2005. So, yes, that was successful. It did bring Lebanon one step forward. And this revolution will probably bring Lebanon one step forward. It remains to be seen, like, how much that this revolution can accomplish, given the extreme tensions that Lebanon has always been the center of, from its sectarian constitution that divvies up seats between Christians and Muslims, to the fact that Hezbollah controls the bottom half of the country, to the fact that there's at least still what, a million Syrian refugees in the country. I mean, there's so many things that will keep at least I'm not doing dipping tobacco anymore. There are so many things that will keep Lebanon from becoming the sort of fully developed, happy place that it should be. So I suppose the real question is, what do you mean by success? Question, Logo Cool Extreme. Will the slump in electric car sales in China save Saudi Arabia? No, they will not. What is interesting, what I was thinking about this week is Elizabeth Warren has talked a lot about banning fracking in the United States. And I think that would not save Saudi Arabia, but it would provide a temporary reprieve, because it's not a question of saving Saudi Arabia at this point. There's just no way, with a country that is based on petroleum products as it is, there's no way that they're going to make it to 2030 with their same governing system. It's just simply not possible. Again, this week we've seen, their attempt to put forward the Aramco IPO being stymied because nobody's interested in the investment. I think more and more people are waking up to just how that's not going to work. Can policy choices impact the speed with which we get to the post-Saudi future? Absolutely. I think that if Elizabeth Warren banned fracking in the United States, I think Saudi Arabia would be more likely to last until the mid 2020s or the late 2020s instead of just the mid 2020s, because that would, of course, have a real impact on shale oil production in the United States. That would mean that Saudi Arabia's oil was more valuable again. That would mean the oil price would go up. Of course, if the oil price went up, then the demand for electric cars would go up again as well. So Chinese electric car demand has fallen this year because of a change to the subsidy regime, but that doesn't mean that people are going to stop buying electric cars in China. That's just simply, that's not what the data show. I think actually that's probably the story from the fall of the Chinese car market. The Chinese electric car market post subsidies is how durable it has been, despite the fall in subsidies. And I think that in the context of higher oil prices, then China is going to get even more interested in supporting the electric car market. So I think that, yeah, regulatory things matter. Regulatory changes have real impacts, but I think we've already reached the point where most car companies in the world make electric cars. And if we do get that oil price spike that, say, Elizabeth Warren's ban on fracking would create, then prices will spike in the short term, but it will drive electric car adoption, and the end result will be the same. I mean, I wish I knew I was as up on mathematical and sort of systems terminology, but I think there's something about this system that it's moving towards an equilibrium, and you can sort of you can distort it, but it's still gonna, oh dear, is it troublingly close to efficient markets theory, which is not smart. But anyway, all right, moving on. Questions. Tariq Sulbi says, lol, he knows nothing. He actually hates Saudi Arabia. I don't take his world too seriously. I don't hate Saudi Arabia, but I think you should probably take what I say seriously. It's already happening, in fact. I mean, Saudi Arabia is already changed completely from when I made that video 2 years ago. It used to be a consensus-based monarchy. Now it's turning into a one-man dictatorship. So, in a sense, Saudi Arabia, as we knew it, is already done. Orient Express asks, what do you think about the Turkish and Kurdish situation? I did a video last Tuesday on that called Donald Trump is Saving Syria from Washington, D.C., its worst enemy. It really is. I thought that when I made that video last week, I thought that the U.S. effort to sanction Turkey over the invasion of Syria was just sort of a quick one-off thing. But it seems as if the U.S. Congress is really pushing this forward. I mean, it's way too early to say whether anything will actually happen, but the just distortion of what's being discussed is kind of blowing my mind. I mean, I talked in last Tuesday's video about how the most important betrayal that the United States committed in Syria was not of the Kurds, it was of Turkey itself. We should not have been supporting the Kurds in the first place. You can watch that video for me talking about that. But what's also interesting is just this sort of denial of basic reality. Turkey has invaded territory that was held by the SDF in the United States that in shorthand is referred to as Kurdish, and everybody in the US media is going crazy about this genocide against the Kurds and ethnic cleansing of the Kurds. But what's kind of crazy is that Turkey hasn't actually invaded any historic Kurdish territory. Now, they did a year and a half ago. They invaded Afrin, which is absolutely historic Syrian Kurdish territory, and that was horrible, but nobody cared about that because US soldiers weren't there. In this intervention, starting last week or a week or two ago, the Turks haven't actually reached any Kurdish areas, which is kind of crazy. Yet we're talking about this genocide against the Kurds. You know, the part that Turkey has taken, and there have been killings, there have been horrible things happening, was stuff that before 2011 was strictly Arab territory. So it's kind of, I don't know. I think on that question, you should take a look at you should take a look at the video I put up last Tuesday, and also just keep in mind that so much of what we're being told about this conflict is just horseshit. Yeah, Victory, MFF, I answered that question. Yeah, Victory, I answered that question. Do I think Lebanon revolution will succeed? If you keep asking that, I will block you. So how about you stop doing that? Cra40N1 is, why is the U.S. parting ways with Turkey? I don't believe it is, actually. I do not believe that that the United States is Fatal Guerra. We'll get to that question. Cra401 asks, why is the U.S. parting ways with Turkey? I think that the U.S. foreign policy establishment is trying to turn Erdogan specifically into a new Saddam Hussein. And I think Erdogan, because he's an idiot, is participating in that and giving them all kinds of excuses. But I think what's happening is a lot of dumb people like Senator Lindsey Graham or people at the Council of Foreign Relations are getting out ahead of themselves. There are countries where the defense industries, the U.S. defense industries and the U.S. foreign policy community is free to destroy anything they want. Iraq is an example, Libya is an example, because all of the business elements who might care about Iraq or Libya are talking about taking oil out of the country. So, they're happy to do that by dealing with the regime on the ground, or by actually owning stuff with a new regime that was set up by U.S. occupiers. So they're perfectly fine with that sort of thing. The U.S. foreign policy community's attempt to turn Turkey into the new enemy is going to fail because Turkey is not some rinky-dink petrostate that can be battered around like that. It's too important economically. It's too linked into sort of supply chains in Europe. It's just too big, frankly. It's a country of 80 million. It's a top 20 economy. So what's happening right now is a lot of dipshit senators and morons at the Council of Foreign Relations, phenomenally ignorant people, are talking about this idea that, oh, we're going to kick Turkey out of NATO, and we're gonna do sanctions. We're gonna do this, that, and the other thing. And yeah, there will be some sanctions, but at the end of the day, like sort of the true masters of the world, people at U.S. banks, people at U.S. multinationals, people at European banks, European multinationals will be like, hey, assholes, knock it off. Because, there are power plants in Turkey that are funded from the outside. There are real estate developments. Turkey is a real prosperous country. And Erdogan, for some reason, for domestic political reasons, thinks that he can get some kind of mileage by, playing this decade Saddam Hussein. And there are a bunch of foreign policy people who don't really understand the world at all, who think that they can turn Turkey into this new pariah state. But I think they're gonna be corrected fairly soon. And especially like their whole narrative is really hurt by the fact that Erdogan is suffering politically in his own country. So yeah, I don't think that Turkey is going to be moving as far away from the United States as people seem to expect, because people don't. And this is really a broader thing. I fall into this, and it bugs me. The amount of time and effort we spend talking about countries where violence is happening, that's not where power is in the world. That's not what really matters in the world. That's another aspect of everyone's like, oh, we abandoned the Kurds and nobody's gonna, this is the end of U.S. power. The U.S. world order is failing because we abandoned the Kurds, and it's just such ignorant horse shit. Because one of the most depressing and enlightening conversations I've had this year is with a friend in New York who works in private equity, and we were sort of discussing just generally the Middle East and Yemen specifically. And I was just going on and on and on about, this horrible thing that we're doing in Yemen, and the suffering of Yemen. And this guy, I mean, he's a really well-intentioned guy, but and I think even he sort of regretted this after he said it, but he was like, yeah, but at the end of the day, I mean, Yemen's just not a very significant country. And I was like, what do you mean? It's, 40 million people are dying. He's like, no, just economically speaking, it's a country that doesn't matter. And as horrifying as that was to hear, that was absolutely true. I mean, you look at just sort of the gross domestic product of Yemen, and compare that to any other country in the world. It's there's no business there. There's not a lot of really great opportunities for finance guys. There's just not a lot of there in traditional economic terms, which made it the perfect candidate for a horrific decade of violence and destruction. Syria was similar. And that's a profoundly sad thing. But as far as how power and economics works, these countries that have wars in them, it's an indication that they weren't actually that important. Turkey is that important. So this attempt to turn them into a pariah state is going to fail. As another example, there's Russia. I mean, Russia is a country that is tremendously important, economically powerful, etc. That the foreign policy community has tried desperately. CNN and MSNBC have tried desperately to turn into a pariah state over the past 20 years, but over the past, certainly over the past 3 years intensely, and over the past 5 years since the Ukraine thing, but they've kind of failed. Sanctions are in place, but I mean, you've got sort of Russian and Ukrainian oligarchs, palling around with Rudy Giuliani. I mean, it's too rich and too powerful to really see the kind of destruction that the U.S. foreign policy community likes to wreak, likes to make happen. So, okay, question. Oh, there was a super chat from Fadel Gueda. Let me go back to that. Thoughts on the decline of Haftar's forces? Excitement. So in Libya, Donald Trump, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have set up a new strongman named Haftar. I mean, Haftar has been a factor for at least, I think, at least since 2014. Haftar and his Libya National Army have been an important factor in Libyan politics. Libya is the North African country that Obama and Clinton destroyed in 2011, leading actually to the decline of the EU. It's been a mess ever since. Haftar was sort of the CIA solution, also supported by Saudi Arabia, UAE, France to some extent. This is the guy who was going to be the new strongman. And he looked like he was making some progress. He controlled most of the east of the country. Of course, he's also a brutal strongman who relies on a bunch of uncomfortably jihadist militias. So at the beginning of this year, or about 5 months ago, with the support of Donald Trump, he chose to attack the internationally approved UN-supported government in Tripoli, Libya's capital. The idea, supposedly, what was sold to Trump, no doubt, was that this would be some kind of quick victory. Instead, it's been an absurd quagmire, loss of life, and it appears that Haftar's coalition is beginning to fragment, which is a good thing. What's interesting is that up until this really dumb move, I want to say it was in April, Haftar was having some success. I mean, he was setting himself up as the real official military as opposed to all these crazy militias. But having decided to make the war significantly worse with this attack on Tripoli, I think he's lost a lot of that legitimacy, which is I think a good thing. So yeah, Haftar's forces, to the extent that Haftar's forces are declining, I haven't read a Libya article in a couple of weeks, but my understanding is that his attempt to take Tripoli, the capital and largest city of Libya, failed. I mean, it failed in the first couple of weeks. It was clear that it was just sort of a stagnating mess. That was the sort of thing that was going to succeed immediately or not at all. And if there have been recent developments in recent weeks that lead to Haftar's decline or end, that would be a good thing. I mean, I'm not wishing for his death. I wish him a happy retirement in the Virginia suburbs where he lived for most of the past 20 years. He should go back there with his family and open a falafel shop or whatever it is that Libyans are into. Sorry, that was probably a little racist. But yeah, so yeah, I'm not a fan of Haftar, obviously. James Cook asks, will the U.S. try to overthrow Mexico's government to install neoliberalism back in Mexico? I certainly fucking hope not. And no, I don't think so. I think AMLO is the new president of Mexico. I guess not so new anymore. He was elected this year, I believe, or was he elected last year, but only came into office like earlier this year? Ran as the anti-Trump, sort of populist, but more left-leaning. What's interesting about AMLO is my understanding is he's obviously, because he seems capable of reading as a smarter guy than Trump, but doesn't seem to be one for the details really, and had a sort of populist left platform that he ran on. And there's some very big things like I believe he canceled Mexico City's new airport because that was seen as sort of a corrupt elite thing. But generally, I mean, AMLO has been working fairly well with Trump. I think generally, the sort of border crisis thing, crisis at the southern border with asylum seekers from Central America is, I think, largely dissipated because AMLO participated with Trump in slowing down that flow of asylum seekers. And he's not as anti-business as he was sold as being. I mean, he's your classic Latin American left winger who is very happy to enrich himself once he's in power. So no, I don't think there's much risk of the U.S. trying to overthrow Mexico's government. Mexico's an interesting thing because, at least classically, the United States got kind of burned by the Mexican Revolution back in, I believe it was 1910 through 1920, thereabouts. Is that right? The instability, having that kind of like sort of monstrous instability on its southern border wasn't worse than a left-leaning policy. In the 40s, admittedly, it was really well timed. I think in the 30s and 40s, Mexico had a very left-wing president. I don't quote me. Is it Cardenas? No, I must be wrong with. I might be wrong with that. But they had a very left-wing president. Luckily for Mexico, at that point, the United States was too focused on the Great Depression and the warm-up for World War II to actually try to intervene. But that sort of set Mexico on a comfortably left-wing path. And while the United States will absolutely fund more neoliberal, more business-friendly candidates and forces and attempt to shape Mexico that way, I think we learned from the Mexican Revolution 100 years ago that that having the kind of instability that doing like a Syria operation would bring in Mexico just isn't worth it. So I think that actually Mexico's sort of sheer size and power, there's what 120 million people in Mexico, and just the size of that border. I think that the U.S. realizes that even if the Mexican government is more left-leaning than we'd like, we do not want the kind of instability that a revolution would lead to, because we saw it during. I recently did listen to Mike Duncan's Amazing Revolutions podcast, talking about Mexico, and we absolutely did it. Mexico, after a U.S.-friendly dictator from like the 1870s to 1910. Elected a more left-leaning guy that the U.S. ambassador decided was super anti-U.S. and a raving socialist. So we murdered him. We worked with a right-wing general to murder Francisco Madero, or rather, we essentially endorsed the right-wing general to murder Madero. And then for the next decade, Mexico was horrific, murderous chaos that involved raids across the border from Mexico to the United States. So yeah, we did it. We tried to overthrow Mexico's government for being too left-wing, and yeah, that was that ended up with Texas small towns getting sacked and raided by Mexican revolutionaries. So yeah, we're not going to fuck around with that again. I mean, admittedly, nobody in the U.S. government knows any history, but you got to hope there are some adults in the room. Anyway. Logo Cool Extreme. How has Trudeau won in as a liberal in Canada despite #MeToo and blackface allegations? So what's interesting is that Trudeau did not actually win the election, or at least he did not win the popular vote election, in the same sense that Donald Trump did not win the U.S. election in 2016. The conservative guy actually got more more votes, got like 34% of the 34% of the vote. I think that, but Trudeau did get 33%. There's a Green Party that got a whole bunch. There's another left-leaning party that got a whole bunch of votes. Um, so it's now pretty clear that Trudeau will remain as prime minister, just in a coalition with one of the other left-wing parties. So, I mean, he didn't actually win. And I think that without the blackface thing, there was a chance that Trudeau could have gotten. I mean, I don't know. Don't quote me on that, but I don't think he would have gotten an outright majority, but he would have done much better. So I do think the blackface allegations have had an impact on him. It's interesting because there's sort of absolutely. I don't know if it's really a double standard because I don't know that there have been a lot of blackface scandals for people on the U.S. right wing. Honestly, I think that outside of the South, I don't think any politician on the right would have been that stupid in the United States in recent decades. Specifically blackface in Canada, there's an interesting, weird thing. Whereas in the United States, blackface for decades has been seen as a pretty horrifyingly racist thing to do. Because U.S. Mores and sort of cultural preoccupations spread all over the world, it's sort of seen as being as bad in Canada or Australia or the Netherlands by people in the US who, write a lot of the English language media. It's not necessarily seen as being as bad, even by left leaning people in Canada or Australia or the Netherlands, because they have their own traditions, and their tradition of abusing Africans isn't as egregious and central to their stories as it is in the United States. So that's one reason. I mean, so first off, Trudeau didn't win. The blackface, they're not allegations, they're photos that he's acknowledged of Trudeau in blackface on multiple occasions, dressing up for parties and whatnot. So when Trudeau did lose, the blackface scandal absolutely affected him. Three, I don't think it's quite as important outside of the United States. And then four, there's also just, a lot of left-leaning people who were absolutely appalled by the fact that Trudeau likes to, put shoe shine in his face and pretend to be a black person. We're like, well, he's better than the conservatives. I saw a lot of that on Twitter. So, and that's also worked in the United States, which is just fucking mind-blowing. We've got Governor of Virginia, Northam. You might remember about 6 months ago, there were huge blackface scandal. I mean, I think he was at least once in a yearbook in blackface, in a med school yearbook. It's just mind-blowing. I think in the 80s, when even back then it wasn't really okay. So that's kind of shocking. I expected him to be removed, but he wasn't. He's still there because it's Virginia and the Virginia Democratic Party. I don't know what the fuck the Virginia Democratic Party is thinking. But if, we won't get rid of a Democratic governor in Virginia for doing blackface, it's kind of ridiculous to expect the Canadians who have a different history with African Americans than we do. It's hard to expect them to make a bigger deal out of it than we do in Virginia. So Sam says the world order is falling apart and the Freemasons are losing power, but is it going to end with a nuclear war? This is exactly what I was talking about earlier. It's not. The sad fact is that Yemen, Syria, the Middle East are countries that are economically insignificant enough that they can be left at the mercy of U.S. defense companies who want to, make a couple $1 billion blowing them up. And real power it's like the amount of attention that we focus on Yemen or Syria is, maybe 40% of the energy that we dedicate to foreign policy. Whereas in terms of its true, like, systemic economic significance, it's probably like 1% of the significance of what's going on. The world order is not falling apart. The Freemasons haven't had power for quite some time. And could it end with nuclear war? Yes, but that's decades from now, not at the current state of decay. All right. What do we got? Questions. Logo Cool Extreme asks, how effective is Russian meddling in U.S. elections? I would say not very. There was a great analogy recently on Twitter. It's sort of like, most sophisticated business types or most sophisticated adults in the United States will acknowledge that online advertising is hit or miss and doesn't have much of an effect unless it's Russia and it's during an election, in which case it's the most effective thing imaginable. So, I mean, to the extent that Russia was involved in hacking the DNC and getting those emails out, that was something. That was something, but it's nothing compared to James Comey's fuck ups. It's nothing compared to just the New York Times and the Washington Post decision to spend a lot of time focusing on Hillary's emails rather than Donald Trump's career of fraud and nastiness. It's nowhere near as important. Russian meddling is nowhere near as important as the fact that nobody liked Hillary Clinton. Nobody had ever liked Hillary Clinton. These were just real basics that people should have paid attention to. I think that most of the conversation on Russian meddling, Russian hacking is by sort of it's driven by sort of old-fashioned gatekeepers who want more power over the conversation, politics, etc., and see the possibility of Russian meddling as a way to take some of that power back through regulations and intimidation. I am not a Tulsi Gabbard fan, but it's outrageous that she was being described as a Russian asset over the past week by people like Hillary fucking Clinton. So it's very clear that accusations of Russian meddling or being a Russian asset are ways to sort of manipulate the conversation and give power back to old gatekeepers. So was there Russian meddling? Of course. Did it have some impact? Doubtful. But obsessing with Russian meddling is something that makes me more suspicious and worried than the actual Russian meddling itself. Okay. Rahim El Mullah asks, Bigger, why is nobody talking about UAE to begin with? That's sort of an interesting point. The United Arab Emirates is sort of like Saudi Arabia, except without all the poor people they have to keep happy, and just a little more effective and a little more powerful. Just kind of interesting. They're nowhere near as rich as Saudi Arabia, but they have very few people and a better run state that actually has a military that matters. So the UAE is sort of seen as a junior partner to Saudi Arabia in a lot of these things. They're aligned with Saudi Arabia on a lot of foreign policy goals. But some argue that they exercise a lot of influence on MBS and Saudi Arabia as well. So the UAE the United Arab Emirates is probably a more powerful, more impactful actor on the world stage than they typically get credit for. And that is definitely worth recognizing. James Cook asks, actually, I guess he asks Local Cool Extreme, how effective was American meddling in Ukraine Maidan elections? This is going to be something interesting. It's always fascinating. Years from now, probably 40 years from now, 50 years from now, chances of me being here in 50 years are slim, but some of you will actually find out with declassification, assuming there's still a US government or the internet in 50 years, with declassification, you guys will discover just how involved the United States was in the Ukraine Maidan protests in 2013. My hunch is that we were very involved. There's already been revelations about Victoria Nuland, who was involved, high up the State Department there, married to a famous neocon, who was essentially just um, organizing the Ukrainian opposition during the protests, which is kind of insane. Sort of setting up the government in waiting. Obviously, John McCain went to a protest rally. Like, I mean, that's the equivalent of Vladimir Putin, like, coming to Trump rallies and being like, yeah, go get Clinton. It's insane. So, yeah, obviously, the U.S. meddling in the Ukraine coup in 2013, infinitely more powerful and effective than what Russia tried to do in 2016. I mean, obviously. How much that movement, that unseating of, I can never pronounce this, Yukonovich, how much of that was driven by the United States, we won't know for 50 years, but what we already know is that it was very extensive. Okay, questions. Logo Cool Extreme. Mofri, why does Saudi Arabia not have to deal with massive protests like in Lebanon? I think that's actually been answered in the chat already. But yeah, briefly, Saudi Arabia didn't have to deal with the Arab Spring, doesn't have these protests in Lebanon, and that's, as they said in the chat, straight up bribery. My understanding is that in 2011, back when the oil was still flowing free and the Saudi government was flush, I think they doubled. Did they double the government budget, or did they just double government salaries during the Arab Spring? So, in a country where most of the breadwinners work for the government or in companies affiliated with the government, during the Arab Spring in 2011, when all the Arab countries were rising up, Saudi Arabia doubled government salaries. So it's straightforward bribery, and that's the thing. Life is fairly easy in Saudi Arabia, or at least it has been. And that's why Saudi Arabia is so vulnerable. That's why I talk about Saudi Arabia being finished, because when that ability to bribe off the populace dissipates, as it already is, I mean, economic growth has been essentially flat in Saudi Arabia for the past 5 years. When that ability to bribe the populace when things goes wrong dissipates, Saudi Arabia is going to fall fairly quickly. Because there's a lot of people, a lot of have-nots in that country. It's a country of 40 million. And yeah, there's, a lot of rich people, but a lot of not rich people as well. Fatil Gueda asks, is Greece holding the rest of the Balkans back? I would say no. Which is kind of interesting. Is what has been happening to Greece over the past 5-10 years been a difficulty? Yes. The fact that Greece has, I believe, at this point, unfairly been held down by European creditors. I think Greece lied about some of its GDP figures. And that led to a extraordinary crisis. Was it in 2009 or was it 2011 or both? That's just been this rolling crisis. Greece should have suffered for the fact that its policymakers lied for a couple of years, for sure. I agree with that. Greece has now experienced a decade-long depression, and really intense loss of economic capability, just economy that is really quite unprecedented and quite horrible. It's been sort of shielded by the fact that any Greek with an education has been able to go elsewhere and get a job and send money back to his family, but it was sort of entirely unnecessary. What sort of happened in the aftermath of learning about just how screwed up Greece's finances were was that all the banks who had loaned money to Greece were bailed out, but all the poor Greeks who lived there and had no part in these decisions didn't get anything, and they're sort of kept under kept laboring under this illusion that Greece is ever going to be able to pay back these, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of bailouts. Is it hundreds of billions? But it's lots of billions of dollars worth of bailouts from the IMF, from the EU, from is it the ECB? Is that the Troika? Anyway. So I think what's been done to Greece at this point is just unfair, and there absolutely should have been some debt crammed down, some relief for Greece by this point. So the problem is, because Greece has been such a shit show and has been maintained as such a shit show for the past decade now, is that it's impacted the willingness of Europe to allow other Balkan countries into the EU. So I think it was recently a big news that, was it Moldova or was it Macedonia, was told that no, they couldn't start accession talks to the European Union, which I think is insane. These are tiny countries that would benefit immeasurably from joining the EU at very little cost to the EU. But it's definitely, I think, as Fadel Guetta was alluding to, it's definitely the Greek experience that is why the EU is leery of letting those Balkan countries in. So I do think that's holding them back. Well, I initially reacted negatively to that question is the fact that, I mean, even today, my understanding is that, like, Greek GDP per capita, the Greek economy is larger and more sophisticated than many of the other Balkan countries, even countries like Croatia that have made it into the EU. I mean, Greece has had a horrible decade, but there was a time where it was a mostly developed country, and it has many institutions. So I don't think it's necessarily even behind. I don't think it's behind many Balkan countries, is it? Haven't looked at the details, but absolutely yes. Like, the experience it's had is keeping other Balkan countries out of the EU, which is a shame. Local Cool Extreme asks, why have you soured on Tulsi? Does it have anything to do with the Modi allegations? Yes. So Tulsi Gabbard is a person running for the Democratic nomination for president. She has possibly the best, she and Sanders probably have the best foreign policy of anybody running, in that they're actually against forever wars. The problem with Tulsi Gabbard is she's got a great argument, but she just doesn't seem to have a lot of knowledge beyond that argument. She's not actually against forever war, really. She's against some of the dumber aspects of forever wars. She's someone who actually, I haven't actually heard her said this, but I have read profiles of her where they point out that she is someone who believes in the war on terror. She's someone who believes in confronting Iran. She just thinks that our regime change wars are a stupid way of doing those things. I don't believe in the war on terror. I don't believe in confronting Iran. I think these are both bullshit things. Tulsi Gabbard is someone who went and fought and believes in the utility of the U.S. military in the Middle East. I do not believe in that. However, just the mere fact of the fact that she's against regime change wars, against what we've done in Syria, against what we did in Iraq, makes her better on foreign policy than anybody else in the Democratic field other than Sanders. However, she just doesn't back it up with much. There was a debate this past week, where obviously Trump's activity in Syria came up. And it was a tremendous opportunity for her to talk in detail about, look, guys, you're telling me that we have to be worried about Kurdish genocide carried out by the people that everybody on this stage wanted to support for the past decade. Why aren't we talking about why all you guys gave money and arms to the people who are killing Kurds today? She could have said that. Instead, she just sort of said regime change wars, and grandstanded, and didn't really, she was not an effective advocate for the aspects of her policy that are intelligent. What turned me against Tulsi, was long before any of this, was a video that I should have saved, because it comes up a lot now. A video that I should have saved that pointed out that where she specifically was talking about how impeachment might lead to a civil war in the United States. And that piece of rhetoric I saw as so irresponsible and so just deeply, deeply wrong and incorrect that I became incapable of listening or supporting anything that Tulsi Gabbard said after that point. I just the fomenting the idea of civil war is, I think, in the United States is one of the most irresponsible things that anybody can do, and anybody attempting to run for president should never do that. So yeah. Tariq Al Sulbi asks, Rob, do you think you're a little too attached to history? I mean, for my social life, for my ability to date, yes, probably. For my interpretation of current events, no, actually. Um, I think it helps me understand what's happening and do a better job of interpreting world events than really, anything you'll see on cable news. Certainly anything you'll see from the Council on Foreign Relations. But can that be extreme? Yes, I think, because I mean, things can change. There are new things under the sun. There are new things in the world. Things can be surprising. That's what makes following what's happening in the world so exciting. But I think if you want to understand what's happening, if you want to understand what will happen, nothing is more important than a firm grasp of history. And I'm not just talking, I'm specifically talking more recent history, like the past 200 years. I think people get very wrapped up in Roman history or ancient Chinese history, or, sort of historical narratives that really aren't the Crusades that really aren't that important for analyzing, what's actually happening today. I would focus on what's happened since industrialization, both because we know so much more about what happened once people became literate and became able to engage with it. Since then, than we know about anything before that, but also because we're living in the world since industrialization, not a pre-industrial one. So I don't know if that made any sense. Orient Express. Do you think Erdogan's Ottoman Caliphate ambitions will fail sooner or later? I think they failed already, really. And I think that when it's weird because Turkey kind of won in the short term. They successfully destroyed the idea of a Syrian Kurdish statelet. That's pretty much over. With Assad running around, Turkey doesn't have to take any more territory to destroy that. What's going to happen, what I think is going to happen, and that they really have to worry about, is that when Turkey's militias, the so-called moderate rebels that the US armed and supported, those are Turkey's militias in Syria. They're militias made up of Syrian rebels. When those folks realize that Turkey's destruction of Syrian Kurdistan was amazing for Assad, that it helped Assad gain back a significant chunk of his own country, the chances that the rebels are going to turn on Turkey and Erdogan are very, very high. And so it's been perplexing to a lot of people. It's like, why has it been so easy for Turkey to occupy northern Syria? It's been so easy for him to occupy northern Syria because all the rebels on the ground there really wanted him there and really thought that that they were on the same side, that Turkey and the rebels were on the same side against Assad. If, as it shakes out, which to me is obvious, and I think will become more and more obvious to more and more people, that this Turkish invasion benefited Assad more than anybody else, I think Turkey's sort of pet Syrian rebels are going to get very angry, very resentful, and things are going to start going very badly for Turkish soldiers in northern Syria. So I think I will probably do a produced video on that topic. So I think it's very likely that that is where the Ottoman dreams sort of die, even though I think they're kind of already dead. Hebrew name points out Mexico didn't have a real democracy till the 1990s. I think that's actually that's not entirely inaccurate. Um, the PRI, the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, controlled Mexico from the revolution, I think, in the 1920s until 2000. But there was an opening up process that went through the 80s and 90s that eventually came to fruition in multi-party democracy in Mexico, which we saw starting in 2000s. So yeah, I think you're right. Hebrew name, but I don't see quite what the point is. Logo Cool Extreme asks, how is Captain Ottoman Slap not receiving any electoral consequences for his warmongering? Do the Turks not care anymore? First off, Captain Ottoman Slap, Erdogan, absolutely received electoral consequences for his warmongering. The fact that he lost local elections at the beginning of this year, that's pretty clear electoral consequences. There just aren't any more elections until 2023, unless I believe Erdogan's AK party breaks up. And I'm not sure if that's happening or not. But also, it's important to acknowledge, as I did in my video last Tuesday, that going after the Kurds is popular in Turkey. 40,000 people have died since the 90s, or since 78, but I think most intense in the 90s, in the Turkish state's conflicts with the PKK and other Kurdish revolutionary groups. So if you want to be a strong big man, dick waver, then you rage against the Kurds, and that's popular electorally in Turkey. And much like Trump ran against the Islamic State a lot. I mean, you're against the terrorists, you're against the people. So until Turkish soldiers start dying in large numbers, which I do believe is unfortunately likely to start happening in the next 6 months or so, until that starts happening, you're not going to get many people in Turkey that are angry at him for that specifically. All right, guys. So it's been about an hour and 50 minutes. I have this theory that people are unlikely to watch. If they go over 2 hours, they're less likely to sort of turn these live chats on after the fact. And I think we've covered a lot of good material. I have made up for the fact that the last live chat got cut off. So I think we're going to call it a day. My name is Robert Morris. I run the More Freedom Foundation. If you're watching for the first time, I encourage you to subscribe and hit the bell next to the subscribe button to get notifications whenever I upload a video. Oh, wow, I got another super chat. And Fidel Guetta says, Roma is the best movie of the decade. And that is true. Well, I'm not sure if that's true, but it was a really good movie. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, if you want to follow me on Twitter at RoboLaw, that's a fun thing to do. The conversation goes on all month long there, whereas we only do these live chats usually once a month over here. You can follow me on Instagram at The Golden Age, and I suggest picking up one of my books. Everybody's Lying About Islam describes the U.S.-Saudi relationship and how it's at the root of, look at that. Well, there's a copy right here. Who explores how that's at the root of many of the terrorism problems over the past forever. I have another book that should be out by November 1st called Avoiding the British Empire, which basically describes everything. Talks about the British Empire and how it controlled the world, sort of built the modern world in a lot of ways, and how the U.S. took over from them and is now making a lot of the same mistakes that led to worldwide apocalypse for the British. So that's a very fun book. And yeah, and please support me on Patreon. I believe there's a link in the description here. And links all over this YouTube channel. That's my main source of income, and that's what allows me to keep doing this sort of thing. Other than that, thank you all very much for spending the time to be here. I think we had as many as 60 people watching at some points today, which is always fun. The More Freedom Foundation is me bloviating about stuff, but if I were bloviating here alone, it'd be pretty pointless. And I am nothing without you guys. So thank you guys so much. Really appreciate you being here, showing up, and making all of this possible. Thank you so much.